World War III seems to be buffering, edging, undecided. Right wingers are getting really impatient about it. We've got that sort of beach ball of death, and they're like, come on. And because Israel right now is weighing whether to retaliate to Iran's retaliation, to Israel's retaliation, which happened on April 1st. This is the attack. The same day, by the way, if anyone missed the news, it was the same day that Israel also killed those 7 aid workers at the World Central Kitchen. So they were busy. And just if you didn't get a look at it, actually, do I have it? Maybe I don't. Here we go. So this was the Iranian embassy in Syria. I mean, just completely leveled. 7 Iranian military officials were killed. A hugely brazen act. We didn't really hear about it. Again, overshadowed. And for weeks, Iran said it would respond, and it finally did over the weekend, launching those 300 drones and missiles at Israel. Most were shot down thanks to our taxpayer dollars, not to brag. But the real thing is, like, this is the first time that we're seeing this level of attack directly on Israel, and immediately the war drums start to beat. Everyone gets excited. The media is like, yes, when's it happening? And for the first time, interestingly, Biden seems to be calling for some restraint from Israel. Obviously, totally A-okay to keep genociding Palestinians, but this, not a good look. He reportedly told Netanyahu the U.S. is not going to participate in any counterstrike or any counter strike, whatever strike we're at this point. And so this is, the initial reaction, I think, to some of this, and I saw this, was just like, oh God, here we go. Iran is the super predator of nations. And I just find that so absurd and so Islamophobic, that we immediately get into that rather than saying this is a sovereign nation that's had a lot of shit done to it, thanks to Israel and the United States. This Jazeera article that sort of talks about this shadowy history of Israel's attacks on Iranian soil. And it's like, what kind of attack would you like? Here's the Iranian scientists' attacks. And there's, 2010, 2012, 2020, 2022, the cyber attacks. This is all to sort of undermine their nuclear ambitions and whatnot, or under those auspices. The drone strikes and the raids. So it goes back. And so this is just kind of, again, another piece of this. But before we get the right-wing reaction, I'm curious about your reaction to this, Sam, and especially Biden. Biden saying, look, hey, rein it in. Let's not retaliate. We're not going to go there with you, even though we're going to give you, if you did want to retaliate, all of the weapons to do so.
It's hard to know. I mean, because Biden has been supposedly very mad at Netanyahu for months now. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. He's extremely angry. Mm-hmm. The quote I heard is that they're not going to help with offensive activities. So it's unclear what constitutes offensive activities. Israel goes, bombs Iran. Then if Iran decides to retaliate again, it's unclear, what role we would take. I mean, I'm not a fan of the Iranian regime by any stretch, but they have exercised a significant amount of restraint. And mm-hmm. Certainly were in contact with the U.S. beforehand and made it clear that we're going to do this one-off and then we're done. And that's what they seem to have done. I was talking to Matt Duss on the Majority Report today. We had him on to talk about this, and there's some writers out there who I think are, sympathetic or more than sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, who feel like while Iran had justification, they were retaliating for a rather unprecedented attack on a consulate, mm-hmm. That they sort of shifted the narrative a little bit, where Israel became, at least in the context of like the Washington blob, more sympathetic because they were under attack all of a sudden, despite the fact that they instigated it, and probably instigated it for this exact reason, so that they could be attacked by Iran, and with the hopes of drawing the U.S. into a wider conflict. That seems to be like what Israel's wanted to do from the beginning. So I don't know. I don't know if Biden's, doing anything other than posturing, because that seems to be what he's done for the most part. So I guess time will tell. I don't think Bibi Netanyahu is going to get out of office easily, and so that almost necessitates, him going after Iran, and maybe, who knows what they're going to be doing in terms of Rafah.
Right, trying to get lucky and pull Biden and the U.S. in. I mean, I think to me, what's interesting when you see the reports around this, like obviously most of the missiles were struck down by, missile defense systems. I believe there's one 7-year-old Bedouin girl who's still in critical condition. But other than that, no casualties. But it's so interesting when you read reporting, because it's like, well, 2 U.S. officials say that Iran's really serious and they're super mad and this is only the beginning and there's going to be more. But then these other 2 officials are like, actually, this was more performative and it was just sort of a like, hey, don't mess with us. And there was a lot of warning and, they want this to be it. And then it's like, oh, why don't we get a clear story? And it's like, oh, yeah, because we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran directly. We're all going through, back channels and other actors here.
Yeah, I think also my guess is that making, all of the sort of confusion and obscurity is almost by design, because they want to give the opportunity for whatever sort of domestic pressures Iran had in terms of why they needed to retaliate, even though that they wanted to make it clear that we don't want to escalate. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that it helps to have, an opportunity to sort of cherry pick which statement from which U.S. official do you want in terms of like what you sell domestically, because, they really do have the opportunity to sort of, filter that. Israel probably has a similar dynamic, frankly, in terms of how much they've been, stepping on censoring both their media and even like, people on social media as well. So I have a feeling that the confusion and the mixed messages are deliberate. But
you mean from the Iranian side?
I think from everybody's side. I mean, I think the idea is they don't want to overstate and make it look like it was just performative. The U.S. doesn't, because they want Iran to be able to take credit for doing it. And there are some tangible things. I imagine they all got, intel as to like what Iran can and cannot do, maybe. And Iran has a sense of like what Israel and the U.S. can and cannot do in terms of defenses, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, the Iranians did it for somebody. And if they're telling the U.S. on one hand, we're going to stop as soon as we do this, and we're just going to go basically on the margins in terms of what we aim at. They also don't want to seem like they're being cucked. And so they've got maybe there's mixed messages so that they can sort of have their cake and eat it too.
I think that makes sense. I mean, what's interesting is that like actually Iran is the sort of level-headed, calculating one, where it's like now we're all waiting on Israel to be level-headed and calculating.
100%.
Cool. Don't like this situation. Don't like where we are now. We haven't seen them be cool and collected for 6 fucking months, if not longer. But okay, so that's our reaction. But what about the right that somehow doesn't understand that there is no American appetite for war, even among their base, but of course is going to use this to try to hit at Joe Biden? Here is former, what was he?
Newt Gingrich?
Bolton.
Oh, John Bolton was the former ambassador to the UN. Advisor. Yeah, well, under Trump, he was national security advisor. Under Bush, he was the recess-appointed ambassador to the UN.
God. Crushing it. Here he is.
Joe Biden, as some press reports have it, is urging the Israelis not to retaliate at all. He is an embarrassment to the United States. This is an American interest to make sure that Iran, which is the principal threat to international peace and security in the region, is at a minimum put in its place, to spare Israel, to spare the Gulf Arabs, to spare us from the threat that they pose.
Yeah, the biggest threat in the region for sure. Is Iran. So there's John Bolton. Here is Senator Kennedy on this.
And today, the White House has already leaked to the press early this morning that they're not going to participate in an Israeli response to what Iran just did. Let me say it again. More sheep is not going to solve the wolf problem. My advice to the president today, for what it's worth, Mr. President, don't. Stop it. Support Israel. With respect, go to Amazon and buy a spine online.
Buy a spine online, as I hear every little bit of saliva in his mouth.
You know where that guy is? He is Harvard
Where they
educated,
exhumed him from?
Harvard educated. I think he was also a Rhodes Scholar.
Of course, they always are. They always are.
He majored in enhancing his Southern accent when he's on Fox News. That was actually his major. He was a dual major, to be fair.
Spine online.
Well, they're lunatics. I mean, first of all, John Bolton was so war hungry that a Republican-controlled Senate would not confirm him to the United Nations. He had already called for the United Nations to basically be blown up. Right. So George Bush appointed him as a recess appointment in I don't know if it was 2004 or 5. I can't remember when it was, but he was too bloodthirsty for a Republican-controlled Senate. Now,
or Bush.
For Bush's Senate. Bush appointed him, but the Senate wouldn't confirm it. It was a Republican-controlled Senate.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, to be fair, the Republican Party is that bloodthirsty. And I think, look, they're looking for any way to hit Biden on this. The sane, reasonable way is to say, how come you keep funding this genocidal ethnic cleansing slaughter in Gaza? But for them it's easier to just fall back on the demonization of Iran. And Iran, again, like we've said, they have been very clear that they don't want to escalate. If you look at Hezbollah and which is probably of the major parties that are involved in terms of surrogates for Iran, they have been rather muted in the north. I mean,
yes, surprisingly.
To some extent. And Biden's doing what he should be doing, which is trying to avoid a wider conflict. There's another way to do that, and that's to say to Israel, you're done with all this and use our leverage. But yeah, I mean, John Bolton can go F himself, and Kennedy is full of shit too.
But I think this is the difference between who you have in power when things like this kick off, right? Obviously, who we have in power as a Democrat mattered when Israel decides to go genocidal on the people of Gaza, because we have a Zionist in office. But we also don't have a John Kennedy in office. We also don't have a John Bolton advised administration. And that's when it comes to all of these actors involved, it's who's in power in Iran as well, right? Iran has a right wing who are what the fuck are we doing? Let's go. Had Donald Trump not been president and not unilaterally taking us out of the Iranian nuke deal, there's every reason to believe that our relationship with Iran at this point would have progressed into when we start talking about more of their surrogacy and their financing and support of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. But we're back to, the Biden administration, either because they were incompetent or maybe because we're learning more about their, who they were really operating on behalf of. They would have never gotten out of the Iran deal, but they certainly didn't get us back in. So, yeah, it matters. I mean, Donald Trump, the idea that Donald Trump would be better in this situation, I think is pretty fanciful. Let's put it that way. Yes. Here's just one final clip for you, not from the right, but just a fun one. Here's John Federman. Are these all Johns?
Oof.
here's Federman. And
you and I have a different definition of fun.
Okay. Well, here is Federman on the lack of a reaction, or Biden trying to temper Israel when it comes to, or saying that they won't join in an offensive.
It's astonishing that we are not standing firmly with Israel, and there should never be any kinds of conditions on all that. When a nation can launch hundreds of drones towards Israel, and I'm not going to be talking about conditions ever. And second, I think that also was Iran had to have some fireworks after Israel smoked that Iranian general, and I'm here for that.
I'm here for that. When they smoked the Iranian general. Okay, I'm going to say something really off color, but I just think it's funny that Federman relearned how to speak, but only speaks in Hasbara now. I
just don't understand how, I mean, aside from like what at least appears to be a 180 in terms of his disposition on things. But even if he was always this guy, like, how do you as a senator get on television and say, when Israel bombs a consulate, smokes one of the Iranian generals, that's sweet. But
I'm here for it.
When the Iranians just light up the sky, man, like, it's just, this is like, I mean, aside from, I get that he's become this sort of like rabid Zionist all of a sudden, but don't you have to have, I mean, and I appreciate the vernacular and I don't mind how he dresses, but you're like on Joe Rogan level analysis at this point. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of just embarrassing.
Yeah.
Like, it's embarrassing.
Yeah. Well, it's embarrassing, especially because at least 33,000 Palestinians, most of whom are civilians, have been murdered. Like, that is what's embarrassing about it. It's not even just the language. It's just like the callousness. And he's on the no conditions at all for any aid. I mean, he truly is just cashing these checks. Like, that's where, like, he's going for it. And he's decided that this is what's going to be. And, you know, he's a senator now. Yeah. Like, how do we get him the fuck out? I mean, right. So this is the question, is like, actually, and I've been talking about this for 6 months, is like, you know, I've always seen like Palestine, it's important, but it's like, you know, it's not necessarily my litmus test when it comes to progressive politics. It is now. It sure as shit is now. Because if you're going to fan the flames, I mean, geopolitically for a World War III, but also if you're going to be okay with a massive genocide and ethnic cleansing, like that, I'm going to have a problem with that. So, he's just proof that I think we do need to vet some of our progressive leaders if they, like, you know, seem like they're working class and like talk about unions good. Like, okay, but is he accepting checks from AIPAC?
Yeah,
anyway.
I mean, you know, it's hard. It's hard to make these assessments. I mean, if you look at, I think, is it Frost or Kazar or one of those guys who was rather sort of like tepid on this question, you know, during in his election, but after the fact has been much better when it comes to voting. I mean, it's a tough environment to make those assessments beforehand. Although I will say there's people who, you know, were skeptical of Federman for different reasons prior to the primary, but I'm not sure that anybody could have predicted this. I mean, he's like, I feel like even Joe Lieberman, if he was alive, would be embarrassed by this.
R.I.P. Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think Joe Lieberman is embarrassed by this at all. But yeah, it is. I mean, you and I have both had Trita Parsi on our shows, and Trita, just back to the lack of diplomatic solutions. Trita's said, like, we need to get back into the Iran deal immediately. What are we doing? Why are we dragging our heels? And even at the time, I think this was like a year ago, he was on my show, and I was like, yeah, that seems important. But also, like, okay, there's a bunch of other things. Now it's important. Now, I mean, truly, in a moment's notice, That's how volatile, and also that's how much we've let the peace process completely atrophy, die. I mean, what a sham the entire thing has been. Ro Khanna just called in, actually, guys, or his people did, and they have to cancel for today, but we're going to reschedule for Friday. But one of the questions I have is like, where do we go from here? And I do think, as you've spoken about on your show, that Israel is absolutely a pariah going forward. And so, I mean, I hope we set out conditioning aid, not just when there's a genocide on, but going forward during the occupation and the so-called status quo that is never actually that status.
Yeah, I mean, for years I've been arguing with my friends who were more pro-Israel than I was. And
who are they? Name names.
Well, one guy named Mike, who I think I actually had on the show. We would have these arguments on these emails. And
really?
Yeah, like, dude, you don't understand that you're worried about the existential threats to Israel. You're the existential threat to Israel because you don't realize that this is unsustainable. What the way that they're operating their country is unsustainable, and that eventually they're going to lose the support of the Democratic Party, and it may come in 10 years, maybe 15 or 20. And the only thing they're going to get in terms of support is sort of like the rump politics of the U.S., like really the Christian Zionists. And they're going to be isolated in the rest of the world. And I think that's where this is headed. And I find it scary. I mean, because,
super scary.
I mean, South Africa,
I also think
South Africa became pretty isolated by the mid 1980s and mid to late 80s, I guess. I'm trying to remember now. And they were not run by a mixture of religious zealots and sort of like, full on fascists. They were fasci. They were white supremacy, but I think there are elements of the Israeli government, aside from sort of like the baseline problems with the country and the project, but there are elements in there that are super, super fasci and super, super like religious fundamentalists. And I don't know how that ends with a country that has both the nuclear weapons that they have and the real deep-seated righteousness. But they're going to get more and more isolated. We're never going to see a Democratic administration that is this pro-Israel again. Ever. I mean,
new poll out this week, 57% of Biden voters say that this is a genocide. Not should we condition aid, not 57%, it's a genocide. I mean, they're just wild.
It's crazy. And it's in many respects so, I mean, obviously the most horrific part about this is the 30, probably twice as many 1,000 that are dead at this point, and the sort of like a burgeoning famine. But for the Biden administration to imperil this election because of this sort of like, I mean, did you see that clip? There was a clip in this book called The Internationalist by a guy named it just came out. I can't remember the name of the book.
Okay.
And there was a quote in there, a story that Menachem Begin told when he came to the U.S. to debrief on the invasion in Lebanon, which was in 1982, I think it was, over the summer. And he went and spoke to a group of senators. And one senator got up and said, "You have every right to kill women and children when you go into Lebanon to protect your country." And Begin, who, remind you, was a part of basically a terrorist group, blew up the King David Hotel in 1947 in Jerusalem. Begin got up and was like, no, we don't do that. I just want to make it clear to everybody here, we're not subscribing to what this guy said. And, please, we're not interested in that. That guy was Joe Biden.
Yeah, I just read. Yeah.
And so I don't think we're ever going to see an administration like this in any way. I find it hard to believe that there's too many people. Maybe McGurk is one of these guys who's, promoting this type of thing. But down the road, I think we're going to see a Democratic Party that is far more skeptical of Israel, regardless of AIPAC money, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's just going to be the case. And
what I do hope doesn't happen, I mean, here's what could happen, is that the right, as they always do, picks up this anti-war mantle that isn't really anti-war mantle, but this sort of like isolationist mantle, and runs with it, as they did during, I think they co-opted the, anti-war movement in the 2003 and 5, which led us to Obama. But then we haven't turned far enough away from the military industrial complex, and certainly not Israel. Obama started to put some daylight in between the United States and Israel. Obviously, that daylight was closed by Donald Trump and then not reopened by, no more distance was put by Biden. And so then you have got, Marjorie Taylor Greene and others who are starting to sour on, not fully sour on Israel, but, starting to see some of the, even Trump is like, yeah, he is genocide Joe, as people shouted his rally. There's like a lane for Democrats to take, and they never fucking take it. And that has a lot to do with.
I don't think the Republicans are going to take that lane. Not in terms of Israel.
They do in pure, just like semantics, in just sort of rhetoric. They don't want another war. Remember Tulsi's forever wars, like that's Tulsi's line, like no more forever wars, but also kill Muslims. Anyway, all to say, in terms of what you were saying lastly, because we're going on, but it's good, about the right in Israel, is I do think that people who are like, I don't like Netanyahu, and a lot of them are like liberal Zionists who I know are like, yeah, Netanyahu's got to go, like Chuck Schumer, who I know, Netanyahu's got to go, don't remember and realize that the alternative to Netanyahu is worse. Like that there is a lot of other politicians in the Knesset who are farther to the right than Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's come back to power despite all of the corruption charges and whatnot, because he could actually form a coalition between the crazies and the crazy crazies. And I think it does expose ultimately what the project of Israel is, which is a settler colonial genocidal or ethnically cleansing project. But we can't do this. There can be no liberation for Palestinians without the Israeli people and without Palestinians living inside of Israel. And I absolutely it's starting to come from them, and it has to continue to. The last thing I will say about South Africa wasn't strategic for the United States in any fucking way. It wasn't like we were trying to sort of control the Southern Cape or something, and that like our oil reserves all came from there and whatnot. Right? There's so much more. No one would have said, hey, if South Africa didn't exist, we'd have to invent a South Africa for our strategic purposes. No.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.